Have you waited for a bus for half an hour and then 15 come along all at the same time? No? Yeah? Well, if you have, you'll know what it's like to actually follow the climate change news agenda at the moment, because the last few weeks have just gone a bit bonkers, really. We had the terrible fires in California, in which hundreds died and over 10,000 homes were destroyed. We've had sort of like ongoing denial and basically confusion from Donald Trump. And in that spirit, we had the US National Climate Assessment released the day after Thanksgiving, when no one was really looking, which was handy because the report was full of dire predictions about where the climate is going, both for the US and the world. And then around that time, we've started seeing protesting school children in Australia, up and down the country in towns and cities, all protesting at their own government's crap response to the climate change threat. And so I thought it was interesting that on Saturday we had the Campaign Against Climate Change march in central London. One of the reasons I think it was interesting is that there were signs, certainly from the Labour Party, from the Labour speakers, that's Clive and Barry Gardiner, that the whole emphasis on dealing with climate change is becoming much greater. And in fact, Clive Lewis was talking about a future Labour government basically remodelling the Treasury so that the Treasury actually put climate change at the centre of all of their economic models, which was very interesting. Meanwhile, Siân Berry, the new joint leader of the Green Party, poured cold water on the idea of there being any sort of alliance in a remodelled left. But anyway, here are some speeches, here are some interviews, and you can judge for yourself what it all means.
As the world switches its gaze to our so-called world leaders at the G20 summit in Buenos Aires, I think many of us look on in despair when we find out that the issue of climate change and biodiversity loss is not even on the agenda. It should be the only thing on the agenda at that summit if they were truly serious about sorting out the world's problems.
The fact that John McDonnell has brought someone back onto the front bench, to the heart of the Shadow Treasury team, to work on sustainable economics with a radical mandate says to me that the leadership of the Labour Party is taking this very, very seriously.
And I'm afraid to say, though, that although climate change and the other planetary boundaries that are now being breached at a rate of knots are the defining political challenge of our times, I'm afraid right now for many of my parliamentarians in Westminster, they've still not woken up and smelt the fact that their coffee is burning. It's burning now and they need to wake up.
So I think the Labour Party have got a long way to go before they can really say that they're green. They're still locked into this economic model that prioritises GDP. They are recognising the need to transition away from fossil fuels to build up new industries, but they've still got really big links to things like nuclear power, things like airport expansion that need to be sorted out before you can really trust them on the climate.
But I fear that what we have in reality is a government fatally influenced by big business interests standing up for dirty oil and fracking companies which are carving up our planet for profit. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report just weeks ago made it so clear that we have just 12 years to drastically reduce climate emissions, just over a decade to stop global temperatures from rising to dangerous levels, until 2030 to head off the destruction of the ecosystem upon which we and every other creature on our planet depends.
So the message from the front bench of the Labour Party has been quite clear. John McDonnell asked me to come on to the Shadow Treasury team and develop something called sustainable economics. And the reason that we wanted to do that is because John McDonnell and the front bench understand that we need the most radical economic policies possible if we are to save our world. And I can promise you now that the next radical Labour government led by Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell would ensure that we make sure the economics of the future puts that challenge at the centre of our economic policy, not on the periphery, not on the outside edge, not as a bolt-on extra, but at the very heart of the Treasury. And that means that when we look at investment, we will also factor in climate change and sustainability.
While they're better than the Conservatives, you do not want to have a Labour government there without strong Green presence in Parliament, pushing them on these issues. It's what I do on the London Assembly, and it's what we need to be having in Parliament too.
Now that doesn't mean that every single member of the Labour Party, all of its voters and all of the wider Labour movement, including every single trade union, necessarily buy into that at this stage. But the fact that it's being taken seriously enough to have that work put in to the very fabric, the very centre of Labour's policy making, economic policy making at the moment, says to me that it's a step in the right direction, and that it's the beginning of a conversation, an internal dialogue within the Labour Party to begin to make those changes required, given the emergency, the climate emergency that we're facing.
We need to bring forwards all our targets now and stop messing around. Let's fix the areas where we've done the least so far. Let's shift transport from the internal combustion engine to being fuelled by our own bodies, walking and cycling, and out of individual cars into shared transport, buses, trains and trams. Let's get on with sorting out fuel poverty with mass insulation and home improvements, sorting out the leaky, damp, cold homes so many of us have to live in, wasting heat, adding to climate change while costing us dear. And let's make renewable energy in our homes and communities the simplest thing in the world to plan, fund and develop. Our communities are ready and willing to do this. And none of this is hard. I mean, did I also mention that this Green New Deal will create thousands and thousands of worthwhile jobs? It'll keep areas, we need to keep areas dependent on current fossil fuels and dirty industries going, and we can do that with these methods. We need a transition plan that focuses on those areas, and we can really create the world that we want to do. I mean, the truth is we don't need rocket science to fix the climate, but we do need the will and the plan to get it done. And easiest of all, let's for pity's sake stop making it worse. Unfortunately, making things worse is what our government is mainly doing right now. It's building more runways, it's building more and bigger roads, it's forcing a new motorway through the middle of England, creating even more car-dependent communities all along its route. It's making this even worse by cutting buses in rural areas and towns across the country. It's cancelling new renewable projects like the Swansea tidal lagoon, and it's clamping down on onshore wind power. It's stopping small renewables from collecting feed-in tariffs. It's forcing fracking on our local communities against their will. And it's arresting peaceful protesters at fracking sites and those who want to highlight their failings by bringing protests to their door here in London.
And obviously the last Labour government tried to push through Heathrow expansion. It changed the planning rules to take away the rights of local communities to turn down major projects like nuclear power stations, like gas pipelines, like incinerators. And that's caused enormous damage, so that needs to be put right as well.
We have 10 years, tops, to be able to decarbonise our economy by 50%. And then that qualifies you for the next 10 years, where you need another 50%. And then the next 10 years, where you need another 50%. Miss any one of those, and you have missed the qualifiers. You are out of the game. We understand that, we know that, and that's why we now understand that we have a fight on our hands to ensure that this country plays its part in making sure that it tackles climate change.
a movement like Extinction Rebellion being a big boost to the Green Party? Have you seen actually any political benefit?
Well, I mean, they're all about pushing all the politicians to get their act together. And I think it's sorely needed, particularly with the reports we had from the IPCC, pulling back on the amount of time we've got to do something about this. We do need radical policies. We need radical common sense policies that are going to sort this out. And it's what the Greens have been pushing for a long time. So hopefully more people will join us and start fighting for those policies. But the direct action's really, really vital at the moment to just bring these issues back into everyone's consciousness.
For many years now, people on the left, many on the left, have seen socialism from a certain perspective. My message to the Labour Party, my message to those who call themselves as part of the left is this. Socialism in the 21st century must be about the environment. The fight for socialism must be about protecting the planet, because as we move into the 21st century, I understand that the fight for social justice, for social and economic justice, ultimately is also one that we, as socialists, understand is a fight against inequality. Because when you look where the most carbon is coming from, the top 10% in this country produce 50% of all the carbon output. The bottom 10% produce just 10% of carbon output. So if you can see the fact that climate change is so inexorably linked to poverty and injustice, then you can see that the fight for the 21st century for socialists is to create a better, safer, sustainable world. And that is the challenge for the Labour Party, and that is the challenge for anyone that considers themselves on the left. And if there is a Labour government in future, we will be with you and we will be fighting for 1.5 degrees to stay alive. Thank you very much.
Unprecedented, rapid, far-reaching change is exactly what the IPCC called for to stop us breaking through 1.5 degrees. We will say that's right. That's why we promised to ban fracking under a Labour government. We'll say that's right. That's why we will end the ban on onshore wind and increase offshore wind by 7-fold. We'll say that's right. That's why a Labour government will create 400,000 new jobs in renewables and energy efficiency. And we'll say that's why it was wrong. So wrong of this government when it asked the Committee on Climate Change to respond to the IPCC report, to then prohibit them from making any changes to the 4th and 5th carbon budget, which sets our emissions limits through to 2032. We will say it's now that change is needed, and the sooner we make it, the better. Rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented. That's why it's wrong to say there's no point in reducing emissions if the rest of the world don't do the same. It's called leadership.
The Conservative government is appalling. They told us that they would be the greenest government ever, but I think we know now how cynical that sham of a claim was. Like Michael Gove's much photographed Keep Cup, their promises are empty. All of us have consistently been let down by Conservative governments who have put their vested interests and their money first. But I have to say, we've also been let down so far by the Labour Party too. Last week was the 10th birthday of the Climate Change Act, 2008. It was a good new law. It was a revolutionary idea. It was hard fought for by campaigners like you and me in one of the loudest and biggest campaigns I've seen in my lifetime. I remember it well. The Committee on Climate Change has been effective in tracking our progress under the Act. It's been an independent voice when the government's failed, and it's them who've stood up and said to the government, we're calling you to account for refusing ever to do anything about car culture and reducing traffic, as a good example. But in contrast to this really good thing the Labour government did in 2008, we are also dealing with the legacy of another act They also passed 10 years ago, last week, on the same day. The Planning Act 2008 centralised major project planning. It took decisions out of the hands of local representatives, and it stopped climate change being properly considered. Its destructive legacy can be seen in many new and wider roads, gas pipelines, nuclear power stations and incinerators across the country now. These were decisions made while local voices and the impacts on emissions were sidelined and ignored under this Act. And the latest idea from the Conservatives is no surprise. They want to bring fracking into this centralised major planning regime to stamp even harder on the rights of communities to stand up for their areas and their climate.
Now, I can't say to you that we have the perfect sustainability and climate change policies at the moment. They're definitely moving in the right direction, and they are the best on offer out of the mainstream political parties. Now, the Green Party would say that it has the best sustainability and climate change policies. That may well be true, but it has one MP and it's a fraction of the size. And given the first past the post political system and dealing with political realities, it's the Labour Party that has the best chance of getting into power in the time frames we're talking about and doing something about it. And one of the key reasons I think the Labour Party will do this, ultimately, is not just because of the work we're doing, but ultimately because this does come down to an issue of social and economic justice. When you look at who is polluting, who is destroying our environment, you begin to see that actually these are age-old socialist principles. It's an age-old socialist fight of the weak and the many against the small and the powerful. And so when you understand that, you begin to see that this is a fight for the Labour Party. This is a fight for social justice in the 21st century.
Okay, given that this is an evolution that's going on at the moment, are we like to see any sort of like signals in the next manifesto, given that we might be having an election sort of fairly soon?
I'm working on that. The team around me is working on that. I think if you look at the Green Manifesto that came out of the last Labour Party conference, it was a work in progress. It's the fact that we produced it says that the Labour Party is beginning to think in those terms. It's something that's happening here and now, and I think people increasingly are beginning to get it. But you know what? The more climate activists that join the Labour Party, that make sure their CLPs are putting those motions into national conference, the more climate activists that join a trade union and make sure that their trade union is reflecting and representing what they think should be happening. They're democratic organisations. The Labour Party is a democratic organisation. The more climate activists that join the Labour Party, the more influence those views will have inside the Labour Party. So there you go.
10 years ago, under a Labour government, this country showed that leadership. We introduced the Climate Change Act, the first one in the world that set the groundwork for the Paris Agreement. 10 years on, in Poland next week, the Paris Agreement is at risk. This should be the COP at which countries begin to ratchet up their NDCs, their own emissions reduction targets. Our government should be taking a lead once again, this time on the critical issue of loss and damage. 21 years ago, John Prescott negotiated the Kyoto Protocol. It spoke of our common but differentiated responsibilities. 21 years on, it's time for us to come of age, to flesh out what that phrase actually means. It means we in the UK began the Industrial Revolution and the era of coal power. We benefited from the economic wealth it brought us. We were the very first major polluter of our atmosphere, and we bear huge responsibility for the climate change that is now afflicting people in poorer countries across the world. It means we must accept our responsibility to help them overcome the problems that we helped to create. Some people would call it karma. I call it justice.
Okay, I'm tempted to ask you also if you can see at some stage in future an alliance between Labour and the Green Party.
But it's a difficult thing to talk about because there is a policy on that, and I have to abide by that.